Corey, how are you? It's James Lowe with iHeartRadio. How are you today?
I am great. How are you?
Pretty good, actually. Let me grab our co-hosts, Don Mazzella and Jay Izzo. Give me a couple seconds here, bringing them up here on Skype. Rooney. We have got a great guest with us today. He joins us live here on our broadcast. And there's Don Mazzella. And we have got our guest joining us here on our broadcast. China threatens to strike back with a possible trade war. That is according to a report from CNBC, and we've got Corey Kupfer. He is an expert strategist, deal maker, business consultant with more than 30 years of professional negotiating experience as a successful entrepreneur and attorney, and he joins us today here on the broadcast. He's the author of the book, Authentic Negotiating. Corey, talk to us a little bit about this, because me and Don cover this with the guys on Tuesdays all the time. Talk to us a little bit about this trade war and your book.
Sure. So, listen, it's good to be on, and this is a classic, challenging negotiating situation that we have with China. I mean, there's a real risk of escalation into a serious trade war, and I know in these international situations, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes. In terms of the more quiet negotiations that are, I'm sure, happening now. But, listen, it's our president's negotiating style. I'm a born and raised New Yorker. I've been very familiar with Donald Trump and his business deals. I deal with people who've dealt with him. I've dealt with him. And, he's got a particular negotiating style. And it includes taking a very, very strong position up front to try to either gain significant leverage above the other person, or at least level the playing field. And then, sort of go from there. That's what he's done here. And, if you listen to some of the interviews with the Chinese ambassador and other people, they don't seem to be backing down. So, we'll see what happens behind the scenes.
Don, give us your take on this.
Well, you're absolutely right. But to me, finally, an American president is standing up to the Chinese. I went with Nixon on his second trip to China, and I was talking at that time with a top State Department official who was in the economic section, and he said he quoted Napoleon's famous line, "Let China sleep, because when she wakes up, the world will tremble." And we've seen that over the years. I happen to think that President Nixon's opening of China is one of the most seminal events of the 20th century. But I think Trump and our guest has outlined that that's a typical Trump way of doing things. Let's take an aggressive position, and I don't mind backing down as long as I get what I want. And we're starting to see the first cracks. If you notice, it's a small thing, but for the first time, the Chinese said that electric car makers did not have to have Chinese partners, and we're also seeing on other fronts. It's funny, if that had been President Obama doing what he did in North Korea or with China, the media would be cheering. But my take on it, let the trade war begin, because in the end, everybody will benefit.
Well, listen, trade wars are, I agree with you that there's an argument to take a tough stand. China's, we've had a lot of issues with China over the years in terms of lack of protection for our intellectual property, in terms of data security, in terms of currency manipulation. But they're coming into the global economy in a stronger and stronger way. And some of that is starting to mitigate, and I think we need to get more of it. The challenge with a trade war, though, is that, listen, everybody gets hurt. So, it's sort of like a game of chicken. I mean, if you notice, the Republican senators from the Farm Belt were already meeting with Trump, and Senator Ben Sasse, announced that Trump had said that we're going to potentially re-enter the TPP, and that's not unrelated to China here, because one of the reasons for that is that whoever the sector that will get the most hurt in a trade war with China is the agricultural sector. For example, 30% of our soybeans are sold to China. So I'm not saying that's not a reason to try to negotiate, but we do have to take into account the fact that there are segments, especially agriculture, in this country that are going to get significantly hurt by a trade war with China.
That's true, and this is going to sound callous, but so what? In the end, I'll give you one industry, the glass industry. The Chinese have taken over the glass industry. It's made it very difficult for American manufacturers. And you can argue, given the byproduct of glass making, they should have it. But when they started attacking the colored glass industry, we in effect backed down and let them do it. And now it's very difficult to find an American glass manufacturer domestically, even owned by the Chinese. So as we go through this list of industries that they're quietly demolishing for us, it leaves us in a very vulnerable position should anything fracture our relationship. And the American farmers, I dare say, 2 years from now, when China and the world suffer some sort of food catastrophe, which we know happens, they're going to be back on top. That's how I feel about it.
Yeah, listen, I think it raises an interesting conversation about the conversation of free trade versus free and fair trade, because there's an interesting split even in the Republican Party, right, with the more libertarian wing saying, hey, we don't want protectionist strategies, and it's an interesting conversation because a pure free trade argument would say, hey, listen, the market is going to correct for all of this. We don't need to put tariffs in place, because eventually what will happen is if companies are not being treated fairly by China, whether it's based upon intellectual property or it's based upon being forced to partner with local companies to get in there, then they won't do it. And over time, as China wants to be more and more of a global economy, and in fact has intentions to challenge the U.S.'s dominance as the lead economic power in the world, that the market will cause them to have to do that. On the flip side, the people who say, "Hey, we need fair trade," argue that usually use that as an argument for tariffs and things like that, and it's a move away from a pure market analysis. So it's an interesting split.
We've got a great guest with us today. We've got Corey Kupfer. He is a national strategist. He is also the author of the book Authentic Negotiating. We've just been joined by Jay Izzo as well. Don and myself have been chatting here with Corey about this basically someone standing up to China, striking back with a possible trade war. Jay, what do you make of all this?
Well, hey, Corey, how are you?
Great to be with you.
Thank you, and thanks for chatting with me on LinkedIn. So, Corey, there's some things out there that I don't know if I'm confused at, but one of the claims that China is making is that the Trump administration has not been specific about what the unfair trade was. How do you address that, or are there specifics? We're just not hearing them.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, I think that's an accurate statement. It doesn't mean that there are not specifics that we can point to, but I at least have not seen, anywhere reported that we've made specific claims. I mean, I would think there are some we could make, and the Trump administration may have them. And ultimately, one of the things that China has talked about is bringing this, to the international courts, basically. And if it ever went there, then it would get very specific on whether there were any, anything that happened. But listen, I mean, if you study Trump, whether it's during his presidency or before, he's usually not quick on coming forth with specifics. It doesn't mean there aren't any, but I haven't heard them yet.
Yeah, I haven't seen them either, and I'm trying to figure out Trump's strategy here. I mean, you as the author of Authentic Negotiating. By the way, available on Kindle, Audible, and hardcover on Amazon.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. By the way, and great price, $9.99 Kindle. I just picked one up for myself. I think you should go out there and do that as well. So anyway, there's a plug for the book.
Hey, Jay, I will have you plug Don's book later.
Okay. So I guess one of the things that the ambassador from China has stated is that our economies are all interconnected across the world now. So what kind of potential disasters, because he's Cui, I think is his last C-U-I, I think it's pronounced Cui. What are the potential disasters here from a standpoint of, okay, if we go through with this particular action, what are we possibly looking at here?
Sure. So let's break it down, right? We export about $500 billion. We import about $500 billion in goods from China. We export about $130 billion. So, so if tariffs ramp up, I mean, President Trump has already talked about moving from tariffs on $50 billion to $100 billion. There's going to be a point at which we're putting tariffs on all of the goods that that are going to China, and obviously there's a much higher amount. That are coming into us, and there's a much higher amount that's going to China. So the interesting part there is that that gives us a leverage play over them. But still, there's impact. I mean, we talked about the farm sector, which is the easiest one to talk about, and there's going to be impact there. So we see the political pressure coming on Trump already from the Republican Farm Belt senators. So, he's going to have to, it's one of the reasons why he has said, hey, we're going to potentially re-enter TPP. He's also talked about subsidies for farmers potentially to protect them. So there's ramifications there. There's also potential ramifications as the Chinese are the largest buyer of U.S. Treasury bonds, right? So,
right.
It could cause borrowing costs to go up if the Chinese pull back, and the ambassador, hinted that that's possible, although, it was I know the interview you're talking about, and it was interesting because he kept saying Beijing will announce. So, obviously he has less freedom to speak and didn't want to make any mistakes.
Right.
But we do have a risk on the T-bill side as well.
Now, Don, what do you make of all this back and forth here?
Well, I'm bowing to obviously people who know a lot more than I do. So I guess I'm more simplistic. I've seen the aluminum industry, the steel industry. I've seen where the Chinese have systematically undercut American producers to the point where they either drive them out of business or acquire them. That to me, and if they can't do that, they then use industrial espionage. You use the word fair trade. To me, and going back to John D. Rockefeller, driving your competitor out of business by creating lowest price and losing money for a while. We felt it was bad under Teddy Roosevelt. Now we're saying the Chinese are doing it, yet they shouldn't be attacked for it. I kind of sit here and say, I go back to the glass industry only because I became involved in it and saw company after company get driven to the brink of bankruptcy by Chinese companies coming in and selling glass at a loss. Even if you factor in cheap labor at the time. Now we're talking 20, 25 years ago. But saying that, we're now interconnected and we shouldn't go out after them, I think is not fair to American businesses. I could go on, but I'd like to comment.
Jay, Corey,
Well,
anybody.
Yeah, well, I mean, listen. I hear what he's saying, but I think, Corey, one of the things about your book that I think is so brilliant is the CPR, right? Context, purpose, and results. And we're in a negotiation period here between these two countries, and we do have to look at the context, right? Am I right? You got to look at the context. What's our purpose for doing this, and what results do we ultimately want to achieve, right? How do we right? I mean, am I wrong by using your book, by the way, that you wrote? And I pulled that directly from your book, by the way, that people want to know. This book is practical. It's awesome. It's called Authentic Negotiating. I'm telling you, I've just gotten into it. It's brilliant, and it's down to earth. You should read this book. It's available on Amazon, and a hardcover, Audible. You need to buy the book. So, but Corey, isn't this about negotiations ultimately? I mean, because the truth of the matter is, I get it. China we're importing $500 billion. We're releasing $150 billion, but that $150 billion is pretty important to our economy. So don't we have to kind of tread lightly here too? Am I wrong, Corey, on that?
Well, yes. No, listen, I appreciate you pointing to that, because that's one of the things that I really talk about in terms of a negotiating approach, right? Is that we can't be knee jerk, and one of the challenges of taking a very strong position up front is that if you have the leverage in the short term, that potentially works, right? If you don't have the leverage, then it can really cause a problem. So the real question here in this negotiation is who has the leverage, right? Is it the U.S. or is it China? And and I don't have 100% view on that because it's a complex situation. But what I certainly know is that China has gained more and more leverage. If you study China, they're doing a huge amount around the world, including in a lot of developing countries in terms of infrastructure and investment. And, they're diversifying their interests. And they definitely have a goal. There's no question that they have a clear goal on becoming the number one world power. And that should concern us. But on the flip side, if you look, the other thing you think about in negotiations is you have to take into account cultural approach.
Right.
And the thing about the Chinese is that they have a long-term view, and they're patient. And that's a great, thing in negotiation from their point of view, because, when you take a longer-term view, you're not as desperate. The U.S. is subject to more, political pressures. Now, listen, Trump probably less than a lot of presidents. He isn't. Maybe he'll take a tougher view and not be as influenced. But just the fact that he met with the farm senators and has already said that he's going to look at re-entering TPP shows that there's some sensitivity there. In terms of the CPR conversation, yeah, exactly. I mean, so one, what are the results that we want to get out of this? Because and are those results realistic? I mean, it's great to say, hey, we want everything to be America first and America's favor, but that's not how a negotiation works, right? The Chinese ambassador in that interview you were mentioning made clear that China is going to look out for their interest, and I don't know why we would expect them to do any different, right? That's what we do. That's what they do. That's what the Russians do. So we've got to look at the results, and then the purpose part is the why. Like, why are we doing this? And it's easy to say, hey, we're doing this to protect U.S. interests, but we got to dig down deeper on exactly what we want to get out there. And then, yes, what is the context? I mean, are we coming from an adversarial place with China, and we think that will leverage them, or are we recognizing them as a important world partner here, and taking a different tack in which will be most effective?
Well, and I jump in here, I think one of the major aims is to gain wider access to the Chinese market, and enable American companies to go in and not have to partner with Chinese companies and give up our trade secrets. Boeing is building a plane manufacturing plant in China, and in effect giving the Chinese some of their hard-won technology. I think a long-term goal at least as I see it, and I heard Henry Kissinger pointed out just 2 weeks ago at a conference that if we could gain unfettered or less fettered access to the Chinese market, the American and Western business ability will generate greater profits. If we get that alone, and we just got the first inkling with admittedly the electric car, then I think it's a good outcome for the United States.
First of all, I didn't even know Kissinger was still alive. Okay,
I know, Don. That amazed.
Kissinger was still even living.
Yeah, that just amazed me. That amazed me.
I happen to have known him for a long time, and I happen to think, even at his advanced age, and even though he talks very slowly, he makes sense. He keeps making sense.
It's amazing.
Well, First of all, Henry Kissinger never spoke quickly, so if he's in his older age, I can't imagine how slow he's speaking today. I'm still shocked that he's still looking down at the grass. That's all I'm saying right here. Okay, I had no idea. But Corey, there's a bigger issue here. I think that you touched on briefly, but we are indebted to China, right? Because they bought notes, right? And see, this whole thing about people wanting to punch China in the face, it is just not that simple, because China has how much of our debt, right? I mean, they could call us on
it's huge.
Trillions.
Huge.
There's trillions of dollars of debt they could call us on that we would be responsible to pay, and then what? So, I mean, this situation is far more complicated than. Now, I am a little upset that China's pulled whiskey into one of the tariffs. That bothers me quite a bit as a bourbon drinker. That's bothering me a lot. But and you're free to laugh at that at any time. Anyway, but it's a far more complicated issue than just these trade tariffs. It's a bigger issue. Am I wrong here, Corey, or am I going off the wrong end here?
No. I think you're right on the mark, and I think, listen, here's the challenge, because we have politics and sound bites with the media, and then we have the reality of negotiations, right? And this is true not only on the China negotiations; it's true on on TPP. It's easy to say, or on the Iran deal, or and I'm not taking a particular position on any of them right now. I'm just saying that the sound bites are, that's the worst deal in history. All these trade deals are against the U.S. or or we gave everything away to Iran, and we may or may not have. But the point is, it's never that simple, right? There's all kinds of parties involved. There's a million issues that are being negotiated. There's trade-offs that were made, and it's so easy to pick out one point that you don't like about a deal and say this is bad, and we'd all agree it's bad. But the point is, in a negotiation, you don't get everything you want. You might have gotten 3 things that you traded off in exchange for that. So, there's an inconsistency between the reality of complex negotiations, whether they're business negotiations or international relations negotiations, and sort of the tendency in politics to have sound bites and say what you don't like about it. So you're right. These things are complex.
Yeah, and I'm sure. Right, as a person who's I'm just a lay person just trying to figure this whole thing out. But I'm sure that there's people far smarter than I, like you, Corey, who, when you think about this type of thing, that you're going, okay, where's the compensation pieces? What are we really trying to get here? Is it that we're trying to get even? Is it that we're trying to get better? Can we do something with China where we can somebody else will pick up that other $150 billion in trade? I mean, right? I mean, there's just a lot of different holes and avenues, trails that this thing can roll. Correct?
No question. Like, listen, Don mentioned before about wanting better access to Chinese markets for U.S. companies, and I think that's I 100% agree with that objective. I think that's a great objective. And the question is, what will it take to achieve that objective, and what do we need to give up? And because It's not like we just say to the Chinese, "Hey, we want better access to your markets, and you ought to give it to us," and they're going to say yes, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to sit down. The Chinese have their own interests, and we're going to, and there's going to be trade-offs, and we have to prioritize what's most important to us.
Right.
So that's realistically what happens. Now, listen, do I think that there are issues with the history of trade with China, and in terms of access to markets, in terms of intellectual property protections, in terms of currency manipulation? Absolutely. But things are improving. I think the fact that they are more and more in the global economy is actually a big factor in forcing them to move in the right direction. Not far enough yet, but in the right direction. And I think that's one of the fundamental questions, like I said before, the free trade versus fair trade. What is it that is going to cause them to do that? Is it much more market conditions? Because, listen, we talked about, Don mentioned Boeing going in there, right? They're big boys and girls, right? Boeing, whatever technology transfer they agree to, or whatever conditions they agree to access that market, they made a business decision, and they're not, they're sophisticated people. So they decided to take the risks that are involved in it for the upside of the business deal. And, true free market people would argue that's how things should change.
Right.
So I think there's a split between the people who think that and the people who think that we need to level the playing field through basically regulation in the form of tariffs.
Right. We're talking with Corey Kupfer. He's an attorney, a law. He's a strategist. He is a master negotiator, and he's also the author of the book Authentic Negotiating here on KJAG Radio, 24/7 radio. And he's been just simply a brilliant guest. And I could sit here, James, and I could talk to him literally for the next 3 hours.
I know. I know.
Sadly, I know that we have other guests that we've got coming. But I could literally, Corey, sit down with a bourbon, provided that it's not taxed. I could literally sit down with a glass and
bourbon is my drink as well. So you got me.
Okay. Hey, listen. I know this little place on Sullivan and Third. Right down there called Il Molino's down there, right around Sullivan and Third. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. I do.
Okay. Well, why don't we sneak in there sometime? I'll come up from North Carolina. You and I will sneak in there, and we'll grab one and maybe see if we can sneak in, grab a little bite to eat too.
That's awesome.
Sounds good, and we can solve the world's problems.
I love it.
Well, Corey, I appreciate you being with us today. We've got to get to our next segment here, but thank you, my friend.
I appreciate being on, guys.
Yes, there goes.